rendezvous gatherings were spring gatherings where traders and trappers would meet. The trappers would come out of the mountains in the springtime. They would meet the traders. They would barter furs for trade goods. They would get paid essentially for their furs. But these were also gatherings where Indigenous people would meet and trade as well. They were essentially international gatherings where multiple Indigenous nations would come together, and they would last sometimes weeks, and they became so popular that they ended up being sometimes all summer long. And these gatherings were festive. There was gambling and horse racing, and people would get together, make new friendships, new bonds were created. It was just a very unique time in history. I first learned about the Rendezvous probably about 20 years ago when I was looking at the work of a number of 19th century artists like Alfred Jacob Miller. And in Alfred Jacob Miller's body of work, he created a whole series of watercolors where he went to the rendezvous gatherings and created these images that were capturing the flavor of them. He described the rendezvous gatherings as a Saturnalia, and it was this idea of a wild party that really sort of attracted me to the rendezvous gatherings as a place where trappers and traders, like settlers, were gathering and meeting with Indigenous people, and in these kind of uninhibited spring gatherings. One of the anecdotes that I was drawn to was this discovery that Alfred Jacob Miller's patron, or the person who commissioned him to make these paintings, turned out to be a homosexual, a gay Scottish lord named William Drummond Stewart, who traveled to the rendezvous gatherings and took with him a coterie of young men, cases of champagne, costumes. Not only were these like a homosocial environment, there was also a homosexual component through the character of William Drummond Stewart, who took as his lover and eventually his life partner one of the most famous buffalo hunters, a Métis man named Antoine. That just fed and added to the themes that I was exploring with the rendezvous paintings. Because the rendezvous gatherings were these places that were kind of uninhibited, lawless, they were far from the settler societies in the east part of the continent. They held a kind of freedom, and it was this freedom from the social mores of the time that for me was really spoke to the freedom of sexuality, the understanding of gender identity that existed in Indigenous cultures that was new to the settler populations. And these settlers who traveled to the rendezvous were experiencing an Indigenous way of understanding gender. The rendezvous series started to evolve as a way to express a more free way of expressing our gender identities and our sexualities. And so the paintings became more exuberant and more playful. So the Rendezvous series to me is about how we think of gender as being at the frontier of society now. When I first read that Alfred Jacob Miller had described these gatherings as a Saturnalia, I immediately started looking back at art history and Bacchanalian scenes. And Bacchanalian scenes, painted by Poussin and other old masters, were often bringing in elements of mythological characters. When my co-writer Giselle Gordon and I were researching Mischief's memoir, we decided to situate Mischief at the center of the rendezvous gatherings because they were a site for these kind of homosocial gatherings, but they also incorporated mythological beings. And so we decided in that telling of that story through Mischief's perspective that she would actually be the inventor of the rendezvous gatherings. We decided that it was her idea to host these gatherings. and invite her friends, her mythological, position mischief in the world of Cree cosmology with all the other legendary beings in Cree cosmology, including the Mimigwesiwak, the Sagachak, the Trickster. The Rendezvous gatherings only lasted about 30 years, and they predated the signing of treaties, they predated the reservation period, they predated a time when Indigenous peoples' freedoms were restricted by government policies. And so these gatherings between Indigenous people and trappers and traders really represented, I like to sort of think of it as a golden era of relationships where Indigenous people were still the dominant populations in these areas. They just represented a kind of freedom